Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for Gamma's annual GeoInsurance webinar. I think we should have everyone that's registered. Hopefully they're on now, or they'll be joining us very shortly. My name is Richard Garry, and I'll be your host today. Our aim with GeoInsurance is to update you on some of the topics related to physical and property risks that might affect pricing and underwriting and the insurance sector in general. This can be a very big area, but we will focus today mainly on flood risk. Recent tragic events in Valencia have really brought a lot of focus on flooding, which seems to be getting worse due to the effects of climate change and human impact on land use and urban development. Just this morning, the European Union's Copernicus Climate Change Service published a report that said that this year is virtually certain that's their quote, to eclipse 2023 as the world's warmest since records began. And closer to home, according to Met Éireann, 2023 was the wettest and warmest year since records began in Ireland. And it also included the wettest March and July and numerous flooding events, including Storm Betty and Storm Babette. So we are delighted today that Peter Thorne from Maynooth University has joined us, and he has studied the effects of Storm Babette on Midleton and Cork in particular, and he will bring us through his findings. Richard Cantwell will also take us through a recent report produced by Gamma, working with the Central Bank of Ireland on the flood insurance gap. But before we get into that area, we have a presentation from Charlotte Cuff, Gamma's Chief Data Scientist, who will give us an overview of a new initiative we're working on, which is using address clustering to unlock better ways to make data-driven decisions about property risk. Charlotte, I'll hand over to you to take us through it.
Thank you, Richard. Hello, everyone. My name is Charlotte Cuff. I'm Chief Data Scientist here at KatRisk, and today I'm going to talk about what we can learn by comparing a building with its closest neighbours. In the world of statistical modelling, and especially so when it comes to risk modelling, we are usually interested in what's going to happen. So will this house be burgled, or maybe it will catch fire, or will this piece of coastline suffer from erosion? Or it might be more accurate to say we are interested in how long on average until these events might happen at these locations. But whichever way you look at it, we are interested in what is likely to happen in the future, but our models can only use data that already exists in the present, and often that data consists of records of what has happened in the past. And a lot of the time this approach works well. If the same river has flooded the same area year after year, it does make sense to expect that pattern to continue. If a road accident black spot has been the site of many crashes over the years, it's reasonable to expect that drivers who commute that way will continue to be at risk of accidents in the future. But of course, there are also modelling tasks when relying on previous events is not so reliable. And in particular, climate change means that areas which were previously relatively safe from extreme weather events may be at higher risk in the future. But weather patterns and floodplains and road networks and all of these things, they all involve quite large-scale systems that spread over wide areas. And in this talk, I'm actually going to pull back from the big picture and zoom into the level of the individual properties or buildings, particular reference to the ESG topics of physical risk and transitional risk. Individual properties do vary in their vulnerability to physical risk. So how well can the roofing withstand a windstorm, or is there any flood mitigation built in? Or conversely, is there a basement that would in fact allow flooding to do even more damage than usual? And outside of the ESG framework too, the construction also plays into other hazards. For example, if there is no open fireplace, the risk of a house fire is going to be lower. Then, in the event that damage does occur from whatever source, the reinstatement cost is also affected by the design of the house. Now, not just in terms of total size, but the layout. So comparing a 150 square metre bungalow with a townhouse of equivalent size but over 3 stories, the bungalow is going to need a lot more foundation and roof compared to the townhouse. So even though you've got the same total area, the cost of rebuilding it would not be the same. Then there are all of the other details that influence that cost as well. So maybe there are dormer windows or conservatories or any non-standard design or layout, any complicated features that might increase the rebuild cost above and beyond the standard amount per square metre. In terms of transitional risk then, housing is a significant contributor to our greenhouse gas emissions. The average dwelling in the SCAI database is responsible for 55 kilograms of CO2 per square metre. There were just under 1.9 million households on census night in 2022. With an average size of 113 square metres per household, that comes to approximately 11 million tonnes of CO2 per year just from housing. Now, if every home could be brought up to a B2 standard or better, that footprint could be reduced by 6.6 million tonnes annually. So that would be a 57% reduction in housing-related greenhouse gas emissions. We could do better than halving them. But what's involved in reaching that goal? Well, it depends on the starting point. For some homes, it might be as simple as adding solar panels and some smart heating controls. But for other homes, a full retrofit would be required, which would take longer, involve more disruption, and of course, more cost. And that amount of retrofit cost, the amount of work, very much depends on the structure and condition of the house at the starting point. Some homes are built as one-off constructions, and you'll often see them in rural areas in particular. But a great deal of Ireland's housing stock is actually constructed in batches, in blocks of homes that are built in the same area, at the same time, by the same developer, with the same materials, to the same plans. And this is what motivates the idea of blueprint groups. We set out firstly to distinguish between the one-off builds and those that are part of a multi-unit development. And secondly, we set out to identify which addresses are part of the same blueprint group as which other addresses. So we developed these groups using both the spatial data, the coordinates, the location, and the building features, the characteristics of its form, of its shape. So essentially, we were looking for groups of houses that are close together and similar in structure. So for some numbers, we analysed almost 900,000 single occupancy, residential, non-rural dwellings, and found that about 15% of those were one-offs that didn't resemble their neighbours, while the remainder we were able to cluster into more than 40,000 blueprint groups. Now these groups ranged in size from just 2 dwellings, so that would often be a pair of semi-detached houses. They're like each other, but they're not like what's around them, up to very large estates of hundreds of houses, such as you'd often find in the suburbs of Dublin. And by cross-referencing against other data sources, we can characterize these blueprint groups into particular types. So we can pull out all of the 1990s 2-bedroom terraces, or all of the Georgian 3-story townhouses, or all of the 1950s estates of 3-bedroom semi-detached houses, and so on. So that creates a very intuitive and useful starting point for further analysis and modelling work. And another use is to fill in gaps where data might be missing or incomplete. If you have a known data point about one member of the cluster, you can reasonably extrapolate it to all of the rest of the group. So here is one example. It's a house for sale below the market rate with a note that it has no pyrite-free certificate and therefore it's suitable for cash buyers only. Well, most homes don't have that certificate because they don't really seem to need it. But clearly this particular house is part of a development in which other homes have had issues with pyrite, which is a defective foundation material, essentially. And so there is a concern that because this house was built as part of that same group, it's likely that the same builder was using the same problematic material in the foundation. So 20 years later, this house isn't suitable for a mortgage. And of course, there are many other variables that can be extrapolated in the same way. For example, the number of stories, the footprint and the overall size, the number of bedrooms and bathrooms, the energy rating and the retrofit cost, the presence or absence of an open fireplace, its market value, and whether any of its components, for example, its water tank or its roof material, that might be reaching end of life and needing replacement. The idea is that if you've seen one house, you have effectively seen every house in the group. So this is a powerful way to take a relatively small amount of data, but make it do a lot of work by enriching your knowledge across all of the identical addresses. Now, this has been a fairly brief, high-level overview of a model that was quite complex to develop. It's been a pleasure to talk to you today. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Charlotte. That looks very interesting. Looking forward to see how we can start using that over the next few months. Just before I suppose we go on, it's worth mentioning if you have any questions, there's a button down the bottom that you can press and just include any of your questions there. Our next speaker is Professor Peter Thorne of Maynooth University. Peter is a professor in physical geography and director of the Irish Climate Analysis and Research Units Group, ICARIS. Peter is also chair of the Global Climate Observing Systems Atmospheric Observation Panel for Climate, and he also sits on and chairs several global climate observing systems and World Meteorological Organization bodies and task teams. So we really appreciate Peter taking the time to talk to us today on Storm Babette and its effects on Midleton and Cork. Peter, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Hopefully you can all hear me. So this is with thanks to the World Weather Attribution Group, which is led out of Imperial College London, and also colleagues at Med, who performed this analysis with us on the Midleton flooding event. Just by way of background to this was a self-commissioned piece from RTE, who were interested in answering this question. They were aware that many events across the world had been looked at in this manner, but there had never been an event attribution for Ireland, and they were very interested in what would happen if we looked at the Midleton event as a case study. So what I'm going to talk about is give a very brief outline what event attribution is, orientation to the event itself, looking through the potential hypotheses as to what could have been causing the flood event or contributing to it, disentangling those potential causes, then looking at the formal attribution analysis and asking, well, what next? So this is a very scientific talk. Hopefully I will keep it broadly interesting to you. So firstly, what is event attribution? If you like, it's climate detective work. It's the quantification of whether and to what extent human influence is present in any individual extreme event. So for a long time, we would shrug our shoulders and say, we can't say whether this event is down to climate change. But in the last 10 to 15 years, this has rapidly evolved scientifically. And what it requires is firstly observations. If we don't have long-term observations, we have no way of placing in context the event. Secondly, it requires large ensembles of simulations run on very large computers. And there are two ensembles. There's one with human influences included, the real world, and there's one without human influences, the counterfactual world where we never had an industrial revolution. And you need large ensembles because these are, even in the ensembles, these are very rare events. Extremes by their very nature are very rare. So you need a very large set of simulations, repeat simulations, to really understand the changing odds, if you like, of the event occurring. And the last piece of the puzzle you require really is physical understanding of the event. If we don't have physical understanding, we're lost. So it's really like the Garda coming and looking at the scene and trying to find who is responsible or what is responsible. So to orientate you to the case, Midleton is in southeast County Cork. It's at the mouth of the Ona Curragh and another river indeed of similar size. Both are small, flashy catchments. These are catchments that are some 10 kilometers across. They are small. The river responds very quickly to precipitation, and they drain into Cork Harbour at Midleton. So they drain directly into the ocean. at the edge of Midleton. So what was the event itself? It was a short-lived event in the middle of the day. It was almost blink and you miss it. Within hours, the water had drained entirely. But during the event, much of the centre of Midleton was flooded. That flooding was worse on upstream reaches of Midleton and closer to the mouth of the estuary. If you look at the engineer's report on the flooding, you see this massive gradient in damage. The damage is far higher at the upstream ends and far lower at the estuary. And damage into the tens of millions of euros at least. I think the latest analysis I've seen is maybe of the order 200 million. So major damage to both domestic property and to industrial and commercial entities. So what could have been at play here? What might have been the important things? Firstly, we could have had storm surge. It might have been that the sea was being pushed up into Midleton, causing a surge upstream into the town. Second could be fluvial flooding, river flooding coming down off the catchment. Related to that could have been two aspects. The very wet summer and autumn could have played a part. If you remember back to 2023 started off gloriously, and then about at the end of June, someone basically hit a switch and we reverted to type. In fact, we reverted to worse than type. We had very heavy, prolonged precipitation events for months leading up to this. And the last thing that could be contributing is land use change. We know we have intensified agriculture, compacted soil, all kinds of changes, removed forestry, all kinds of things that could be causing changes to the flooding risk. So let's look through some of these, and these are synoptic charts drawn by the UK Met Office of the 4 days leading up to and including the event. So it goes from top left, 3 days before. There's a very complex set of fronts and low pressure system near the Canary Islands. 2 days before in the top right, that's consolidated into a very complex low pressure system off Iberia. And then in the day before and the day itself, that low pressure is moving up over the British and Irish Isles. So this is synoptically what's happening. You have a low pressure forming over very warm subtropical Atlantic waters and moving up slowly and inexorably to the British and Irish Isles. So the first question we asked is there storm surge? And we're very lucky in that we have two tide gauges in close proximity. One is actually in Ballock Road, which is in Midleton itself. It's only there for 2 or 3 years, but it is a tide gauge at the mouth, effectively, of the river. And we also have Ringaskiddy, which is on the other side of Cork Harbour. If this were a storm surge pushing water into Cork Harbour, we would expect to see high non-tidal residuals at both stations. What we see is no residual, basically, at Ringaskiddy, the orange line, and a very large and almost instantaneous residual of, or the order of 0.7 metres at Ballock Road coming out of Midleton. So it's not a storm surge. That blue residual you see is the water rapidly exiting from Midleton into Cork Harbour. So there is a non-tidal residual, but it is not a storm surge. So we can discount the fact that this was associated with a surge of water coming in. The next thing to look at is the warm Atlantic, and this is a colour scheme of total precipitable water from satellites. And normally total precipitable water over Ireland is something like 10 or 20 millimetres. You can see in this, it's a composite from the day before the storm hit southwest Ireland. You can see the low swirling off Iberia. and you can see that there are elevated total column water vapor in places north of 60 millimeters. So that's 60 millimeters of potential precipitation being held in the atmosphere. And why is it being held in the atmosphere? It's because it's come off very, very warm North Atlantic waters, and what goes up must come down, sadly. Radar returns show that coming down. So this is a sequence of radar images in 3-hour intervals over the event. So you're looking to the southwest of Ireland here, and you can see some very, very heavy precipitation returns in various subperiods over a period of 2 days over Cork, County Cork, and particularly in some of these, you can see very heavy returns, very localized over Midleton itself and surrounding regions. We can look back in historical records, and we don't just look at one record, we look at a range of observationally based estimates. And yes, there are large differences between these estimates, but in each and every data set we looked at, this was the highest 2-day October precipitation total for Cork, County Cork, in October since at least 1970 and possibly even earlier. So this is the rainfall event that had not been seen for in excess of 40 years and may well not have been seen for longer. We can also look at those same observationally based estimates and look at the accumulation of precipitation up to and just slightly beyond the event. So these are starting from 0 precipitation in the beginning of July. And in each and every one of these, July to September, and particularly July to the end of October over County Cork, was the wettest such period on record. Some of these records go back to 1920, others are shorter, but we undoubtedly last late summer, early autumn had the wettest event on or multi-month precipitation event on record. And that meant that soils were heavily saturated. So soil moisture deficit here, positive values of the soil is gasping for water, and 0 or negative values are indicating that soil is fully saturated. And what you see here is that, yes, we had that glorious May and June, and the soil was getting very, very dry, even drier than normal. And then suddenly in July, we turned the bath taps on, and we basically thereafter had either virtually no soil moisture deficit or even a soil moisture surplus. So this 2-day precipitation event was coming on top of very, very prolonged period of above average rainfall, which had saturated ground in the region. So there was nowhere for the water to go. There was no capacity for the soil to take up any of that excess precipitation. So we're blessed with observations. One of the things the World Weather Attribution team said to us is, wow, how many observations, how lucky are we to have all these? So another piece of the puzzle we have is an EPA river gauge at Ballyedmond, which is just a few kilometers upstream of Midleton. And here you can see very obviously the October 2023 event in there. It's by far and away the highest measured water level in a record going back to 2000. The slight caveat here is that the break that was caught, that is there in 2014 to 2017 is because it was washed out. The prior one was washed out by a prior flood. So we cannot rule out that in 2014 there was an even bigger event. But in those parts we have directly observed and we have a record of, it was by far and away the largest such event. So the last thing we looked at was land use change, and we looked at residuals from a hydrological model. And we looked at those and tried to correlate those with changes in land cover type from satellite records for the catchment. And the first thing to say is, over the satellite period since 1970s, the land type seems to have been relatively stable. So it's perhaps not surprising that we see no real signal from land use change, no apparent signal from land use change across the catchment through time. That doesn't mean that land use prior to the satellite era hasn't played a part, but recent land use change certainly does not appear to be a contributory factor. So piecing all the evidence together, there are two fundamental parts of the story here. The first is a significant role for seasonal precipitation preconditioning across Southwest Ireland. Undoubtedly, the fact that the soils were heavily saturated is an important part of the puzzle. And the second part is the 2-day precipitation totals centred on the Midleton region, which were probably the most intense for at least 40 years on a County Cork-wide basis, and probably even more significant within the Midleton sub-region of County Cork. But really, one part of the story that we found out and that we had to tell was that Midleton was saved by the tide. There was no storm surge, but the tides were actively helping save Midleton from a much worse disaster. So the pale grey background curve here that you can see is the tide gauge measurements. And you can see that tides at this point in Barlick Road are varying between about 0.5 metres and 4 metres. So you have about a 3.5 metre tidal range. Now the pink or magenta line is the river gauge measurements. So these are the 5 kilometres upstream of Midleton. And the blue is the tide gauge residuals. And you see in the faint grey, you see that the tide gauge, the low tide is much higher. That's the tide residuals. So if you like, Midleton was being saved by a spring low tide, not just a low tide, but a spring low tide that was occurring simultaneously. And that was it was acting effectively as a vacuum cleaner, actively pulling the water out of Midleton. If this flooding had hit 6 hours earlier or 6 hours later at a spring high tide, with Midleton Harbour, the Cork Harbour sea level some 3-4 metres higher, it could have been catastrophic because you would have had water coming up from the tide, meeting water coming down from the river, and the only thing the water is going to do in that case is move sideways, and you would have had far more severe and long-lived flooding. So Midleton really was saved in this case by the tides and by the lack of a storm surge. If we had had the same precipitation hit at a spring high tide with a significant storm surge, we would have had a really different story for Midleton, far more catastrophic. So formal attribution is the next part where we tried to look at what was important. So the important were the wet late summer, early autumn and the 2-day precipitation event. And we wanted to know, can we attribute either or both of these to human influences? So the first thing we looked at is 2-day precipitation, and these are observationally based analyses. I want you to look at the right-hand one, and you'll see a set of blue lines and a set of red lines. And those are return periods analysis. The red line is the world we live in, the world where we've warmed by 1.2 degrees centigrade. And the blue lines are an estimate of what would happen in a world where we had not warmed. And the blue lines are for each return period, for each amplitude, the return period is longer. So in our changed world, we have made a magnitude of the event 2 to 10 times more likely due to warming of the climate. That's what the observations directly tell us. We can then compare to the models. So the observations that change in probability, the likelihood, but also the change in intensity is now included. They're the blue bars. And then the red bars are all of the different models. And broadly, the models are agreeing with the observations in terms of precipitation as being made more likely and more intense due to climate change for this 2-day precipitation. So this is a synthesis. So we have probability ratios. That's the likelihood. Anything north of 1 means we've made it more likely. Anything south of 1 means we've made it less likely. And the intensity change, which is whether we've made it more or less intense. And the synthesis, merging model and observational estimates, is that we've made roughly twice as likely at the present time and made roughly 13% more intense due to climate change. And looking at the models only into the future, that likelihood and that increase in likelihood and intensity persists into the future. So this is a foretaste of what we are looking into in a warmer world. Now, the 3-month precipitation, the observations do suggest that this has been made more likely. We are making wet late summers and early autumns more likely due to climate change, about 1 to 5 times more likely. So it's less robust than 2-day precipitation. But the models disagree. The models tend to suggest that we actually should have reduced the likelihood and we should have reduced the intensity. So observations and models being in a disagreement leads to low confidence in our findings for the 3-month precipitation. So in synthesis, the observations suggest more likely and more intense 3-month precipitation, but the models suggest less likely and less intense. And the overall finding is dominated by the models because they have lower uncertainty, but it has very low confidence because we have this fundamental mismatch between the observations and the models. So what next? The 2-day event attribution findings, those 2-day precipitation event attribution findings are exactly as we expected coming in. They're consistent with numerous precursor studies. Basically, short duration 1 or 2-day precipitation events are thermodynamics all the way down. The fact that you warm the world means that the warmer world can more moisture can be held by the atmosphere. More moisture held by the atmosphere means heavier precipitation when it does rain, and you get more frequent, more intense precipitation events. The 3-month results are intriguing. Have we happened in the real world to sample an extreme possible world where we happen by chance to have sampled a large number of wet late summer, early autumn periods, just luck, bad luck? The other question is, are almost all models missing key processes underpinning the real world behavior? And these are much more challenging attribution analyses to undertake. So rather than being thermodynamics, it's thermodynamics and atmospheric circulation, because it's a set of repeat weather patterns over a period of 3 months. And we struggle more with that than we do with very short period duration, where we have much higher confidence in a direct association with human influence. So further research is required on that aspect. But the fundamental finding is that, yes, the fingerprints of humanity are all over the Midleton flooding, particularly the 2-day precipitation event. We are responsible for a large proportion of Midleton. It would not have been as likely, it would not have been as extreme without human influence. And worse still, it becomes more likely and more extreme the more we tilt our thumbs on the scales by continuing to emit greenhouse gases and warm the planet. And I think that was my last slide, so I'll leave it there.
That's great. Thanks, Peter, for that. Really insightful, although I think it's a little scary, as I certainly know from talking to some people in the insurance sector. They thought that what happened in Midleton was quite bad. Looks like it could have been a lot worse if the tide was in. Our final speaker today is Richard Cantwell. So he's our head of spatial and sustainability. He's going to present the results of a recent report that we did in collaboration with the Central Bank of Ireland on the flood protection gap. I'll hand over to you, Richard, here.
Great, thanks for that, Richard. So what we're talking about here is a report that we carried out, a significant report. There's a lot of data analysis involved in this. The report that we generated was just one element. There was actually a significant amount of data transfer and modelling done on behalf of the central bank. What they were interested in looking at was what we're calling the flood protection gap. And what a protection gap is, it's a shortfall between economic losses and insured losses. And it can be caused by a lack of access to insurance, or even a choice not to purchase. So people may not be able to obtain insurance, or just make the decision that it's just too expensive. There's too many steps to hoops to jump through to get insurance, so that it's just not going to bother. So for this project, we quantified the flood protection gap in terms of accessibility of insurance, which means if a property is seeking flood cover, is that cover going to be available? So to estimate the size of the protection gap, we looked at to try to quantify the number of properties that are vulnerable to flooding. The input database for this was the Air Code Address database, and also the flood models from JBA, which are in widespread use in the industry. There was roundtable discussions with the insurance industry carried out by the central bank, which confirmed that those flood scores are in widespread use. And we conducted extensive spatial analysis on the data and modelling to quantify the gap, not only in terms of number of properties, but also the cost of flooding. Now, this just covers inland flooding and not coastal flooding, because the cost of coastal flooding are typically under separate models than pure flood models. They're kind of tied in with storms. And there was also some questionnaires that were completed by insurers to cover off the underwriting issues. So some headline figures. The total number of properties considered was just over 2 million, with a kind of a 9-to-1 split between residential and commercial. And out of those, 290,000 buildings are vulnerable to flooding, and 1/3 of that total, so around about 100,000 buildings, are high risk, 2/3 low risk. We also looked at defences, and there's about 69,000 properties are considered to be protected by defences, and these are a mixture of OPW published defences, which the insurance industry uses, but also JBA model defences, again in widespread use in the industry. So the findings were that 1 in 20 buildings, 5% of the total, have limited access to flood insurance. And what that limited access means, that if they were to seek to obtain cover, they would either be refused or would have very few providers willing to provide the cover. And those few organizations willing to provide cover would likely insist on increased underwriting scrutiny. In terms of the cost, just for inland flooding, again, so this is surface water and river flood only, the average annual loss at the moment in the current day is 101 million a year. And again, this, as I said before, this doesn't include coastal flooding, which can be very large. And of course, there's a range of spatial distributions of the protection gap, those properties at 1 in 20. They are concentrated in Dublin, Cork, Louth, Clare and Kildare. Obviously, Dublin and Cork, very high population areas, so they have a lot of buildings. But proportionally, Louth and Clare, which have a much smaller number of buildings, but proportionally much larger exposure. So we looked then at the climate change impact. We've just heard that the things like things are becoming more frequent. The likelihood of extreme events is expected to double by 2050. The most recent EPA report has said, to quote them, the most rare and impactful extreme events will see the largest relative increase in frequency and intensity. Looking at the high-end climate scenario, RCP 8.5, SSP, we will be transitioning to SSPs shortly. An additional 15,000 properties or an additional annual cost of 44 million of inland flooding from the current baseline of 100 million. We also carried out a number of what ifs, and one of those what ifs was around Storm Desmond. Peter mentioned the use of ensembles. So there was JBA have a large set of models and actual storm events in their database, and what the costings of those would be if they were to stall, for example, of different parts of the country across the British and Irish Isles. So if Storm Desmond were to hit the east of Ireland and stall there rather than northern England, which it actually did, the potential loss there is in the order of 1.1 billion. So looking at the insurance acceptance criteria for insurers, these are the different flood scores. I won't go into those in detail, but the deeper the flood and the more frequent it's likely to occur, the higher the score. That has an impact then on whether flood insurance is going to be available. So those with low scores in the kind of blue and green categories are likely to have widespread choice, and when you move into the amber, red and black is where you begin to have either limited or just straight off unavailable flood cover. And these scores are from the JBA models, which are again in widespread use across the industry. If we look at the current protection gap, this we kind of applied those flood scores to every building in the country, all 2 million buildings, and 86% of buildings are not at risk. 14% are at some level of risk. But of that 14%, you can see that 9.6% of them are kind of a green, very low level of risk. But it's when you move into the ambers, the reds and the blacks when you begin to get towards your 5% of buildings which are going to have some issue with accessing flood insurance. And the cost of that flooding then is distributed across those different buildings that fall into those different bands. So for example, there will occasionally be some properties which, even if they're not at flood risk, will experience some very minor claims. The total average annual loss expected for properties which are not at risk from flooding is about €2 per property. But it's when you get up to the 10,000 buildings which are in the black category, extremely high risk, the average annual loss per property there is over €1,700, which is a very high level of cost. So maybe that you can understand perhaps why the insurance companies would not be willing to undertake business for properties that are at that level of risk. The protection gap, as I mentioned, is concentrated in different counties. Louth and Clare have the highest proportion of buildings in the black, red and amber categories, meaning limited or unavailable cover. But if you look at the heat map, you can see that there's definitely areas in Dublin and Cork City and some of the other cities, Galway unaffected mainly, but certainly Waterford, Limerick, Cork, Dublin, Selbridge and Dundalk all have some additional high levels of exposure. But what about the climate change then? Well, we used two scenarios that we used with the IPCC, RCP 4.5 and 8.5. These are aligned with what the OPW have been using in some of their studies, or what the OPW refer to as mid-range or high-end climate scenarios. You can see that the temperature change in the mid-range is 1.4 degrees, the sea level rise, rainfall increases and so on. Again, those are much more significant in the high-end scenario. And again, these are in the JBA models. These are the time frame chosen was to 2050, which is only 25 years from now. But the impact on that is that while the overall number of properties at risk does not increase, the average annual loss does increase significantly. There's a 47% increase in the average annual loss from the baseline for the properties that are in the protection gap. So you can see there, for example, the number of properties in the black highest risk category is now 14,000. If you compare to the previous one, you can see it was 10,000. 57,000 in the red, whereas previously it was 50. 39,000 in the amber, where previously it was 36,000. Again, and the total average annual losses are going up. Again, for the black category, 32.9 million compared to 17.1 million in the current time. So huge increases in average annual losses. The headline figure there is going from 100 million to 145 million per annum. And also large increases in the number of properties which are going to experience difficulties in obtaining flood cover. And again, all of this is assuming that current underwriting practices remain the same. We conducted an analysis to see what would happen if insurance companies decide to keep the level of average annual loss across the book the same, and that would have the impact of bringing down the flood scores at which they are willing to take business on board, so the flood protection gap could widen even further. We also did a number of deep dives. One of those was looking at, are newer buildings more likely to flood? We looked at the air code address database, and while it's an imprecise proxy, we just looked at the date added to the ECAD. So if something was built in 2015 and earlier compared to those that were added to the ECAD in 2016 and later. Again, a rough proxy for recency of construction. And the finding there was that there was a slight reduction in the number of high-risk properties and a slight increase in the number of low-risk properties compared to between the earlier and later. That's not to say that all building in floodplains and the likes has stopped, but there's a wide range of planning conditions that can be attached to construction in those areas now. So there may be building level mitigations which do not feature in this kind of broad brushstroke flood modelling. We also conducted a deep analysis on how flood defences impact on flood risk using both the OPW and JBA flood defence details. And we found certainly, yes, there's localised impacts, but in the areas which are protected by flood defences, there's a very significant up to 80 or 90% reduction in the cost of flooding. But it's important to note that not all types of flood defence are considered by insurers. Insurers do have issues with temporary or demountable defences because they require human intervention to be put into place, and they tend to discount those. So there's a lot more in the report. If you want to have a look at it yourself, you can see it's on the Central Bank website. That's the URL for it there. centralbank.ie/regulation, industry market sectors, insurance, reinsurance, but it should be linked to from the Central Bank homepage. So that's what we have to say about that. Again, my contact details there, and I'll hand you back to Richard if there are any questions.
That's great. Thanks for that. Just one thing before we wrap up, I suppose. I'd like to give you an update on what we've been up to. One of the things we've been working quite hard on recently is AddressLink, which is our property level data repository. What we try to do with it is bring together what's happening in a property, like age, numbers of floors, and size, but also what's happening around it in terms of a lot of the things we've talked about today, like flooding, and then other things like subsidence and crime. So over the past few years, we've added 2 trillion data points to AddressLink for over 35 million properties across Ireland and the UK. And our plan is to continue to grow this over the next 18 months, with a particular focus on how the data could be used to help organizations comply with CSRD, which is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, particularly in relation to environmental and societal risk due to climate change. If you would like to find out more about anything that we've talked about here today, so links to various reports or any questions you might have on the presentations, do get in touch. Details are on the screen. Finally, I'd like to thank Charlotte, Peter and Richard for their presentations today. I certainly found them very interesting. I'd also like to thank all of you for attending. As I said, any questions, do get in touch. Thanks very much, and we'll say goodbye for now.